There were many factors responsible for the disintegration of tribal culture. For example, the railroad, which allowed people to easily access the area safely and quickly. Another factor was the idea of manifest destiny, which gave Americans a sense of rightfulness in obtaining the land that they thought was theirs anyway. There was also buffalo hunting. The plains Indians suffered from lost battles and broken treaties, but even worse for them was the destruction of the buffalo. As the market request for buffalo robes increased during the 1830s and 40s, professional buffalo hunters killed more buffalo. In addition, buffalo hunting became a pleasure sport where railroads cut through the areas in which buffalo were living at. The buffalo hunt was part of the Indian culture that they didn't want to give up, and as the buffalo disappeared, so did the Plains Indian way of life. A Century of Dishonor is a non-fiction book by Helen Hunt Jackson, first published in 1881, that chronicled the experiences of Native Americans in the United States, focusing on injustices. Jackson wrote A Century of Dishonor in an attempt to change government ideas and policies towards Native Americans. She attended a meeting in Boston in 1879 at which Standing Bear, a Ponoka, told how the federal government forcibly removed his tribes from its ancestral homeland in the wake of the creation of the Great Sioux Preservation. After meeting Standing Bear, she conducted research at the Astor Library in New York and was shocked by the story of government mistreatment that she found. She wrote in a letter, "I shall be found with Indians engraved on my brain when I am dead. A fire has been kindled within me which will never go out." Jackson sent a copy of her book to every member of Congress at her own expense. She hoped to awaken the conscience of the American people and their representatives to the flagrant wrongs that had been done to the American Indians, and persuade them to redeem the name of the United States from the stain of a century of dishonor. The book consists primarily of the tribal histories of 7 different tribes. Among incidents, it depicts the eradication of praying town Indians in the colonial period, despite their recent conversion to Christianity, because it was assumed that all Indians were the same. Long out of print, Ross and Haynes of Minneapolis, Minnesota first reprinted A Century of Dishonor in 1964 in a limited printing of 2,000 copies. Her book brought a light to moral injustices enacted upon the Native Americans as it chronicled the ruthlessness of white settlers in their greed for land, wealth, and power. Upon its publication, A Century of Dishonor received some adverse criticism and was dismissed as quote-unquote sentimental, but it had some effect in shaking the moral senses of America, and in 1881, Congress acted to the remedy, in part, the situation of Ponoka people. However, it did not have quite the impact that Jackson wanted, which spurred her to write an emotional appeal to the action
The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up tribal organization and divided Native American tribal land. Under the Dawes Act, Indian life deteriorated in a manner not anticipated by its sponsors. The social structure of the tribe was weakened. Many nomadic Indians were unable to adjust to an agricultural existence. Others were swindled out of their property, and life on the reservation came to be characterized by disease, filth, poverty, and despondency. The act also provided that any surplus land be made available to whites who by 1932 had acquired 2/3 of the 138 million acres the Indians had held in 1887.
An innovation that was devised for prairie life is barbed wire. Life in the American West was reshaped by a series of patents for a simple tool, barbed wire. The swift emergence of this tool as the favorite fencing method changed life in the Wild West dramatically. Without fencing, livestock grazed freely, competing for food and water. Where working farms did exist, most property was unfenced and open to foraging by roaming cattle and sheep. Before barbed wire, the lack of effective fencing limited farming and ranching practices and the number of people who could settle in an area. The new fencing changed the West from vast and undefined prairies and plains to a land of farming and widespread settlement. Wooden fences were costly and difficult to acquire on the prairie and plains, where few trees grew. Lumber was in a really short supply. Also, rocks for stone walls were also scarce on the plains. Barbed wire proved to be cheaper, easier, and quicker used than any of these other alternatives. The first wire fences before the invention of the barb consisted of only one strand of wire, which was constantly broken by the weight of cattle pressing against it. In 1873 and 1874, patents were issued for various designs to compete against different versions of the barbed wire. But the recognized winner was Joseph Gilden's design for a simple wire barb locked onto a double-strand wire. Gilden's design made barbed wire more effective. He invented a method for locking the barbs in place and invented the machinery to mass-produce the wire. The invention of the barbed wire eventually led to the decline of the cowboy profession, and it led to individualized farms, and is indirectly related to the frontier thesis. It also made the wide-open West more enclosed.
The impact of the railroads on settlement of the West was important because it shaped the way ideas were being spread, and the completion of the railroad allowed for the completion of manifest destiny towards the West. Turner's thesis, known as the frontier thesis, quickly became popular among intellectuals, as well as spokesmen for the West. It explained why the American people and the American government were so different from the Europeans. It sounded an alarming note about the future, since the U.S. Census of 1890 had officially stated that the American frontier line separating the more settled and lightly settled zones had broken up. The idea that the source of America's power